So let me just specify that I'm a BIM manager for building. At WSP, it's a very large company. There's some 35,000 employees. And in the building sector, we're 320. So I'm not part of the governance structure at WSP, but I am more involved in the building governance in Quebec. So this afternoon, and I'm just going to adjust my computer here, I'd like to talk about the hurdles. And the biggest hurdle for a consulting engineering firm is the resistance to change. The first thing you need to do is to prove that the change is real. So I took a few pictures off the internet. It's more of a caricature. But I just wanted to show you that time is real and it's over time. No doubt you've seen these pictures before on LinkedIn, maybe on Google. When we did civil engineering, when we used to do mapping, we'd have to actually lie on the floor. And then on the right-hand side, this is an engineering consulting office where you had the huge tables. There were rows and rows of these large tables. And that is how, in the past, engineering would work. So let's move ahead in time a bit. Perhaps some of you used to work with these tools. My father had one like that in his office at home. He had a pedal. You would adjust the table. You could turn the ruler around. There were all kinds of stencils. And then one day, he came back home with a huge printer. It was a blueprint printer. And some of you you remembered that, how heavy that machine was. And this is a real change. Now you were able to make copies of the architect's plan, and then you could put the mechanics on top of it. This was an amazing innovation on the market. So, bit by bit, change came to the market. And I've forgotten to move on to the next slide, but that's what I wanted to show you. And in the 80s, in 1982 more specifically, we had AutoCAD. And this was the first version that is now in a museum. And I don't know if you remember the tablets that you would click on, where you had to actually click on some icons. And that was the future tool that allowed us to do a design with a tablet. All you had to do was click on it, and you could do your drawing with that. Some of you lived through that change. But then we had CAD, and in 1982, they adopted a further CAD. This was computer-assisted drawings. So how much time did it take? 2, 3, 4, 6 years, 8 years? Well, I did a survey. And around 1989, another change took place. It was a more global change. There was some 7 years before there was a gradual introduction of this change. So we mentioned what the repercussions were of this change. We had the SQI presentation, and we talked about PCI project or IPD projects, integrated product delivery products. This is integrated design. So what's happened? What happened between the 1990s to the year 2010 is that we saw more of a hardware evolution. We moved from these huge screens to flat screens. We had laptops. Now we have iPads. There's been a hardware evolution, but today we're in the midst of a process evolution. In IPD, this is a project where we work from design on the left-hand side up until the building operation. So this way of working is new on the market. It's relatively new. So is everybody today working like this? No. Has it been there for a long time? Well, the integrated projects have been on the market for a while, but this joined with BIM is quite new and it isn't completely integrated on the market. And yet, we're noting some changes in consulting engineering. And this brought about new definitions such as levels 1, 2, 3. Some of you, no doubt, heard about these. We're doing level 2, but you also need to understand the depth of level 2. And in consulting engineering, we have to deal with this new terminology. This is a rivet project that we did at the Simons in Quebec City. It's the mechanical room, which is completely aligned on the architecture. It's even as far as geothermal energy, which is modelized. And our fire protection team also uses rivet teams so that it can deliver models on the basis of which we can do estimates and where we can also fine-tune coordination. So what I'd like to talk about briefly today is managing change. I'd like to talk about the resistance to change. This truly is the biggest challenge we're facing in consulting engineering. So what is ADKAR? It's awareness, desire, knowledge, action, and reinforcement. This is an awareness of the change and the desire to undertake the change, the desire to learn, to take action. And once this action is taken, we want to see it reinforced. So the purpose of this awareness is to understand why. Why do we want to move towards BIM? And afterwards, once we understand the why, we need to have that desire to undertake the change, and the next step is to make a decision. Once we're aware, once we have the desire to go ahead with the change. The next step consists in knowing how to put in place the change. It's not enough simply to know about BIM, it's important how to change things in a company. And then when it comes to taking action, the purpose is to be able to carry out change on the basis of the knowledge that we've just acquired. And finally, reinforcement means actions that increase the likelihood that change will continue. We don't want to miss the boat as we move towards BIM and as part of this change that we've just undertaken. So the kind of awareness in consulting engineering is whether or not to invest in BIM in order to possibly be awarded contracts, to be more innovative, or should we wait until we obtain a contract in order to bring about a change? The awareness that we could have is to understand to what extent BIM will change things. We could address the new roles and responsibilities. We mentioned that this morning. There are new processes. Right now, we're talking about design review that might be different from the traditional design review. As well, we're now doing 3D modeling, and coordination is done in 3 dimensions. We have information management. There's also quality assurance and quality control. And suddenly we saw this shared model coordination. There in space, we need to be able to manage all of this data. As well, we're talking about a common data environment. This is a data center or hub that is shared among a team of professionals. So what exactly does this common data environment consist in? We also have to choose the different software, and with this choice of software, we have to deal with different folders. It's not something that we're used to seeing in our field. If you're an international corporation or if you have international business relations like WSP, there's also the language challenge. So we need to work amongst the different provinces, and we need to put in place a blueprint because, as you know, in consulting engineering, we usually work with Revit. So we need to adjust, we need to work on a lot of translation. We have bilingual projects. Again, that brings with it its challenges. There might also be new agreements required for content, for discipline, for materials, and sub-projects. At the time, we used to call that CAD, the layers. That the name has changed, and so we need to manage this as well. As well, this involves certain levels of detail and information that we had to manage that we didn't have to address previously. So we're seeing a transfer of standards of things that used to be in AutoCAD. And Mr. DeCarry was talking about that this morning. To what extent do we want to model the schematics? How far do we want to to what extent do we want to maintain 3D data? And so our methods for doing design might change as well. We also need to learn about standards. Are you familiar with ISO 2017, PS 55, BS 1122, 245, non-COBE? These are all standards that exist under BIM. Are we familiar with them? Do we take ownership of these standards in consulting and engineering so that we can deliver a level 2 BIM? And finally, we could ask a question about why we need this change. Is it to do innovation? Do we want to be more competitive? Do we want to target our clients' needs? And finally, what's the risk of not changing in our methods? Why not stick with our good old CAD? Why not stick with those good old working methods? Of course, as we know, BIM isn't Revit, but BIM brings about a change in habits and tools, of course.
So when you think about it and you think you're ready to make the change, you have to think about, okay, what's in it for me? What can I get out of it as an owner, corporation, or manager of a company? Is it a competitive advantage? Am I going to see performance gains? Am I going to get some contracts in the future if I migrate over? So you have to make corporate choices. Are we going to invest? How are we going to invest? Do we have an innovation strategy? Or do we just get a rush contract and suddenly we have to fill an immediate need? So when the wish to migrate comes in, you still need buy-in from governance. In Quebec, we have Daniel Fignon, engineer, VP, who is piloting the transition to BIM. I and my colleague Frédéric Bisson are working in the regions, in Quebec region, to give advice and to help the company make the change for Quebec buildings, not globally. That's a different level, given the size of the company. Then we have to talk about knowledge. How do you change? How can you change what knowledge you have? Obviously, you have to find out what BIM is, and then you have to figure out how to change. So we make a list of required change. Then you make up a strategy for change. You need training on the new processes, on the new tools. Maybe we'll write some new processes, we'll test them out, we'll assess them, have management assess them. Then we have to assess the tools. Are they useful? Are they effective? Are they efficient? What do they cost? And what are the new skills we have to acquire? What do our technicians need to know? We have over 100 technicians in building in Quebec for a team of 320. So we had to make a list of required training, of staff who needed training, course plans, so that we could transition over and make it less of a rocky transition and a smoother shift. Next step is to actually move. Sometimes you move in a certain direction and then there's an obstacle and you can't go that way, so you have to switch direction. So if you're managing change, you have to figure out a way around or over the obstacles. The actions you take have to show your ability to adapt to change. We have acquired certain knowledge, but now what are the concrete steps we can take as an engineering consulting firm? Well, we make a schedule, you have a strategic plan, we have an objective, a date, we form our draftsmen, we have engineers to train. We talk about implementing processes. They go through project managers and other managers. You can have a 3D model, but it's not useful if you don't use BIM processes. So you really have to have training, and it's all part of managing change. We have new roles, the definition of resources. What does this mean to be a coordinator, an integrator, a BIM manager? I mean, these are terms that were tossed around today, but we have to think about it in human resource terms. If you take a draftsman technician and the next day the contract says you need a BIM manager, well, suddenly he's now a manager. Well, you have to manage expectations. Maybe there's some salary expectations. Maybe there are different expectations. Maybe they're higher. So you have to think about managing expectations as well. Then there's IT management. You need standards. You need to do your procurement. You buy and install and update your IT systems and your software. It's not just buying RAM, but you're also maybe changing your video card, maybe buying SSD disks, upgrading your RAM, of course, installing new software, changing computers. That's a big change. And that's what it really means to update your computer stock. And then what about standards? Well, you need your templates. You have to translate your CAD legends to Revit legends. You have to change the way you do things. You have to translate those typical details so they can fit into your new design software, and that's a challenge as well. You need to change performance and behavior. Some people are completely panic-stricken with the idea of migration. They're worried about their whole career. It's almost all of their psyche and psychology that's involved. Their behavior change requires a lot of reassurance to employees. We have to reassure them that change will be gradual and that it'll go fine, and that the company is behind the change, and the company is also understanding because there are technicians who have more experience. And finally, and in conclusion, reinforcement. You know the illustration of the boy who cried wolf, and when the wolf really came, he was eaten alive because nobody believed him. So if you say BIM, BIM in your company, and you say, yeah, it's great, we want BIM, but you actually don't do anything, and you have no backup, it's not going to work. So you need concrete steps, concrete actions to increase the likelihood that change continues. You have to identify your obstacles and figure out, okay, what's preventing our engineers and our project managers from moving ahead. You have to have BIM meetings and regular BIM communications every month. You have to do marketing, and then you will be on goal. At our company, we set the goal of training all 320 people in BIM and migrating over almost completely wherever possible and depending on client requirements. And of course, you have to recognize and reward the people who do change. So, in conclusion, you're like a giant cruise ship. Maybe your company's a small one. You're just a little sailboat. But regardless, you have to plan for change. It doesn't just happen with a snap of your fingers. But regardless of your size, if you plan your change and your management properly, you will be able to make the change and migrate to BIM. Thank you very much.